All right, let's open our Bibles tonight, please, to 2 Chronicles chapter 36. 2 Chronicles chapter 36. We're returning there again this evening. Of course, the passage that we left off with last week, and so we are literally picking up right where we left off in the last message, and continuing on this evening with the series, Israel, My Glory. And believe it or not, this is actually message number 60 in this series. Message number 60, and I still don't know exactly how many it's going to take for us to get through everything. I told you that back at the beginning, that there was no way for me to accurately predict that, and that's still the case. 60 messages in, don't know exactly how many it's going to take, but we'll just do what needs to be done to try to cover enough detail to get the gist of it. And one thing I can assure you of is that regardless of how many studies it ends up being, it's far short of what it probably should be when it comes to the extent of things that we should look at and understand. And, that's just the nature of God's Word. There's just too much there. And it's an amazing thing. And that's just the parts that I know about. And, you talk about comparing that to all the stuff that we don't know, and it pales in comparison what we do know. There's far more that we don't know than we do know, but nevertheless, with our finite minds that God's given us, we do the best we can and understand as much as we can as His Holy Spirit leads us, and that's going to continue to be our goal and objective as we move forward. And so I appreciate those of you that have stuck with us throughout the duration of these messages. I hope it's been helpful to you, and that it will continue to be as we continue to progress on through God's program with Israel and the Word of God. And so tonight we're looking again at Israel, My Glory. And within that larger 60 message study that we've done so far, we have, of course, been moving from topic to topic and subject to subject under that heading. And most recently, the message that we dealt with, we titled that Of Times and Sabbaths. And began looking at that last week. This is the second installment of that message. This is the part 2. Of times and Sabbaths, and we began last time digging into that fifth course of punishment that we've come to at this point in the history, and looking at some of the details a little bit further about that fifth course. We understand that fifth course of punishment, of course, has resulted in both kingdoms of the house of Israel going into captivity. Both the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom are in Gentile captivity at this point. The northern kingdom, the northern 10 tribes, have gone into captivity under the Assyrians, whereas the southern kingdom of Judah and its capital Jerusalem there has fallen to the Babylonians. And we understand that at this point that Israel's been carried out of the land. And the details of what we looked at last time, we saw that their removal from the land gets linked up to this issue of the land Sabbaths, the sabbatical year, if you will, for the land. And Leviticus 26, as well as some other passages, talk about that. How that as Israel dwelt upon the land, as they came in under Joshua, they've been dwelling upon the land throughout the course of punishment up into the captivity. The land had not been enjoying her Sabbaths while they were dwelling upon it. And so as they're removed from the land and carried off into their enemies' lands, no longer there in Canaan, the land is going to have the rest that it was supposed to have. And we found that the issue of the land Sabbaths there gets synced up, and by the time you get to this fifth course of punishment, there have been 70 of those Sabbath years that have come and gone while Israel was dwelling upon it that they have not observed and not kept. And so when Israel is removed from the land of Canaan, the Lord says that it's time for them to repay, and He's going to reclaim all those Sabbath years that they neglected to observe. And therefore, the amount of time that they're going to be out of the land in Gentile captivity there is going to be 70 years. And we were told that here in 2 Chronicles chapter 36, and we focused on the Sabbaths last time. We spoke of Sabbaths, and therefore in this second part of this message, we're going to be talking tonight of times. So of Sabbaths, and now of times. And we see the connection here with those two issues once again in 2 Chronicles chapter 36 and verse 15. We'll pick up the reading once again. The Bible says, And the Lord God of their fathers sent to them by His messengers, rising up betimes and sending, because He had compassion on His people and on His dwelling place. But they mocked the messengers of God and despised his words and misused his prophets until the wrath of the Lord rose against his people till there was no remedy. Therefore he brought upon them the king of the Chaldees, who slew their young men with the sword in the house of their sanctuary, and had no compassion upon their young men or maiden, old man or him that stooped for age. He gave them all into his hand. And all the vessels of the house of God, great and small, and the treasures of the house of the Lord, and the treasures of the king and of his princes, all these he brought to Babylon. And they burnt the house of God, and brake down the wall of Jerusalem, and burnt all the palaces thereof with fire, and destroyed all the goodly vessels thereof. And them that had escaped from the sword carried he away to Babylon, where they were servants to him and his sons until the reign of the kingdom of Persia. So he's recounting and describing the carrying away, the final deportation of Judah into Babylonian captivity there. And he says that all this was done, verse 21, to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed her Sabbaths. For as long as she lay desolate, she kept Sabbath, to fulfill 70 years. And so we have the coming together of these two issues of the land Sabbaths and the laying desolate of the land while they're removed from it there, with the prophecy that's given by Jeremiah, we're told, to fulfill the duration of the years of 70. Score is 20, 70, is 60, and 10 is 70. Therefore we arrive at 70 years of Babylonian captivity that's been pronounced and prophesied to the people of Israel as the captivities are getting underway here with this fifth course of punishment. And again, as it says, Jeremiah is the prophet that the Lord used to proclaim the issue of their captivity out of the land, and the time factor that's getting linked up to the reclaiming of these land Sabbath years that we talked about last time. Now, the 70 years, of course, is going to be significant to God's program with Israel. Obviously, from this point forward, we're being introduced to it here. And it has impacts and implications upon things that are coming as the program again begins to progress along. And with the 70 years, what we're finding at this stage is another introduction of time demarcation in Israel's program that really gives us a reason to stop and to remember the significance of time overall as it relates to God's purpose with Israel on this earth. And some of the factors of time that we've come through already, and how that this is just another installment of this, because 70 years is a very definite time period, but this is by no means the first instance that we have seen God referencing time in his relationship to the earth and his relationship to the nation of Israel in particular. And time's a big issue when it comes to the prophetic program. Timetables, time schedules, definite numbers of years, or certain events that God said that they're to look for before certain things would happen. And God deals with the nation of Israel that way, and we have seen that and found that to be the case throughout the studies that we've looked at. And that's really true going all the way back to Abraham, and really even before that when you think about it, but especially when you come to Abraham, the significance of time schedules to God's dealings in the world goes all the way back to Abraham. And that makes sense when you think about the program that we're talking about with Israel and what God's doing. Right? We've said all along that all of this stuff that we're looking at here, this is a prophetic program. God's program with Israel is a prophetic program. It's a program of prophecy. And God has made some things known by the mouth of all his holy prophets, the Bible says, since the world began, Acts 3:21. God had been declaring some things from all the way back here at the creation. He's been making some things known by the prophets and introducing these things. And of course, the Lord says of himself in Isaiah 46 that he's the Lord that declares the end from the beginning and from the ancient times, the things that are not yet done. God is able to call those things that be not as though they were. Right? He has foreknowledge, and he has understanding of what's going to carry out, so he can speak of things that have not yet come to pass now, and you can be assured of the fact that whatever God has said will be, will be. And when God utters his voice, he prophesies these things, and he can tell us the end from the beginning, and he deals with Israel especially in a prophecy program in relation to that very thing. He'll tell them what to expect ahead of time, what kind of things he's going to be doing in a certain time frame. And And he gives his people understanding for where they are in the progression of his program with them, with time schedules and time prophecies and those types of things. And it's been that way, again, as the verse says, since the world began. God's been talking about those types of prophecy issues since the world began. And time schedules and timetables especially become very significant and very important when you come to the individual Abraham there, who becomes the father of Isaac and then of Jacob, who is going to blossom, of course, into the nation, as we've seen. And time schedules become very important, going all the way back even to Abraham. And so tonight what I want to do is kind of in parallel to what we did last time. We're going to zoom out from the immediate context of the fifth course of punishment and the 70 years that's been prophesied by Jeremiah concerning this time. We're going to zoom out, and then we're going to take a look at the program as a whole once again. But we're going to do that in the context of time and time schedules. Last week when we did that, we were talking about Sabbaths and the importance of Sabbaths to Israel, and how the Lord himself had a Sabbath back here at the beginning in the creation week that Israel was given in the law that they were to observe. And the other Sabbath types and the feast days throughout their year, and the land Sabbath, of course, in connection with the sabbatical year that we've spoken about already. And we looked at the significance of the Sabbath and its relationship to Israel, the program at large, and how that's coming into view here. Doing the similar thing as we zoom out now, looking back across the timetable, back even to Abraham, and doing a review of the program within the context of looking at time and time schedules. Now, I do that not because I want to belabor points that we've already covered. My point's not to go back and just to hammer things over and over again that we've already talked about and covered. And we have looked at a large portion of these things already, but it's been a while, right? We've been looking at a lot of details. And we've been following these courses of punishment through for a good while now. And even though we've talked about it, even emphasized time in the past, we're a bit removed from it. And I think that it's important when we're coming to a point here where God is giving another segment of time to understand how that this is not a new way of dealing with Israel. This is the way that he's dealt with them all along. And I think there's benefit in understanding how that this is just another segment of time that God is giving them at this time that really fits into a line or a thread, if you will, that goes all the way back to the beginning of his dealings with Israel. And so it's going to be a little bit of review tonight, but focusing in on the issue of time schedules. And so with that as our objective tonight, I'll have you come back with me now to Genesis chapter 15. All the way back to Genesis in chapter 15. Here in Genesis, of course, God has separated out Abram from the nations of the Gentiles, gave the Gentiles up back in chapter 11, and there in chapter 12, had called Abram out of Ur of the Chaldees, told him to get out of his land and away from his kindred, and gave him the covenant of promise that he was going to take him to a land and show him a land that he said that I will give thee. And he's going to bless him in that land and give him a seed, and they're going to blossom into a great nation. And God is vesting his purpose with Israel for the earth in the nation that he's going to create from Abraham there. He's brought him into the land of Canaan at this point. He has commissioned Abraham to walk up and down in the midst of the land there, and the length of it and the breadth of it. A gesture of possession that's signaling to those Canaanites and those enemies of the Lord in the land there that Jehovah is going to take possession of this land. He's going to do that through Abraham and his seed. And Abraham, as he's been walking up and down in the midst of the land, he is looking around. He knows the promise of God and what he's called unto. He's been promised this land, and as he's come into it now, he's looking at his own self and how he's aging, and yet he doesn't have children. His wife is aging, and they don't have children. He's walked up and down in the midst of the land now. He's seen that the Canaanites dwell there, a great mighty people that are strong, and at this point, the promises of God have never looked more unattainable and unreachable. God has shown him all these things that stand in the way of his promise and his word coming to pass. And here in chapter 15, in the first part of the chapter, God has to take him out in the night and show him the stars of the heaven. He has him look up there and he said, "Tell the stars if thou be able to number them." Bringing Abram to the realization that it's impossible for him to do that. Just like it's going to be impossible for him to bring to pass the word of God, the promises and the covenants that have been made with all these obstacles against him. And he says to Abraham that as you look up there and you see all those stars that I made, he said, so shall thy seed be. He makes him a promise. It's going to be a promise that rests upon the faithfulness of God to his word. And at that point, Abram's got the choice of whether he's going to believe God or he's going to believe everything he sees with his physical eyes. And we know that the Bible says that Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him for righteousness. On the basis of faith, God imputes righteousness to Abraham, and that takes place in the early part of the chapter. And then as he comes down here toward the end of the chapter, he's going to ratify the covenant, if you will, by passing between the pieces that he has Abraham divides, signifying that this is going to be a one-sided covenant. An unconditional covenant where Abram's not going to have a part to play in it, but Jehovah of himself is going to perform all that's necessary to bring his word to pass. And in connection with that whole event here, a time is given to Abraham concerning the first segment of the program, if you will, in his purpose with Israel. And we look here in Genesis 15, verse 13. He says, and he said unto Abram, know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them, here's the time, he says, 400 years. And also that nation whom they shall serve will I judge, and afterward shall they come out with great substance. And thou shalt go to thy fathers in peace, and shalt be buried in a good old age. But in the fourth generation they shall come hither again, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. So as the Lord is beginning to deal with Abraham with the promise to make of him this great nation in connection with his purpose on earth, you see that one of the first things that God does is he introduces a prophetic timetable for Abraham to comprehend and understand. He tells him that his seed is going to be afflicted 400 years, and they're going to go into a captivity to a nation that's going to hold them bondage, but in the fourth generation, right, another time demarcation, God's going to bring him out again. So Abraham understands that in his lifetime, these promises that he's received from the Lord are not going to be brought to pass. There's still a long span of time in which the iniquity of the Amorites is going to be filled up as they're dwelling in the land. And God tells him now at this particular point that there's a 400-year timetable that you need to look at. There's 4 generations that you're going to have to look at before your seed comes forth as a nation to dwell upon this land I promised. We know from the history that that is what took place here. He's promised to Abraham. That nation, of course, is the nation Egypt. As Genesis recounts the details of how he begets Isaac and Jacob, and then his name's changed to Israel, and he begets his 12 sons there, and the story with Joseph and all, and how they end up going down into Egypt. And all that generation dies off, and they begin to multiply down there in Egypt. And of course, as you get into the Exodus, it picks up there and talks about their great multiplication, and how the Pharaoh arose that knew not Joseph. And the whole story and the account of the Exodus begins to unfold. And what you've had from this period where the word has been given to Abraham and the timetable's been laid out for Abraham, this period of years and these generations have passed to the point now where God is ready to deliver his people. And you find that confirmation if you turn over to Exodus chapter 12. Exodus chapter 12 here, with all the events that take place with the plagues and the sending of Moses and that whole contest there in Egypt and things that God does. We see that timetable plays out, and the Lord talks about that as he's delivering his people from Egypt here. Exodus 12, verse 40, he says, now the sojourning of the children of Israel who dwelt in Egypt was 430 years, and it came to pass at the end of 430 years, even the selfsame day, it came to pass that all the host of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. Now here he's talking about 430 years, and we were looking at this, we talked about the difference in the 400 versus the 430 and really the starting point from where it's reckoning. But in the selfsame day, it's making that issue that the prophecy that God had given and the timetable that God had given early on is what was taking place here when God's bringing his people out of Egypt. And God's fulfilling it to the selfsame day. But what you've had is God prophesied a time schedule, and in that time you've had him fulfilling his word. Okay? Now, as they come out of Egypt, we know the next stage they go and they cross over the Red Sea. They go out there in the wilderness. They're tested there. They end up signing on to the law contract and going under the law there at Sinai. And in the process of time, God brings them up to the border of the land while they're out there in the wilderness. They're headed to that land that he's promised Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And God brings them up to the border. And if you come over to the book of Numbers, in chapter 14, we see that in connection with their unbelief with respect to God's purpose in taking them in the land. You remember they send the spies in, 12 spies, and they spy out the land there, and they come back, and 10 of the spies give evil report to discourage the people. Joshua and Caleb give the good report. And, of course, you know the story, right? The congregation of Israel hearkened to those that give the evil report, and they don't want to go in to possess the land as the Lord had commanded them. And so in response to that, the Lord tells them what their judgment is going to be, and in connection with that, links up a time schedule once again at that point. And so Numbers 14, pick up in verse 26. It says, And the Lord spake unto Moses and unto Aaron, saying, How long shall I bear with this evil congregation which murmur against me? I have heard the murmuring of the children of Israel, which they murmur against me. Say unto them, As truly as I live, saith the Lord, as ye have spoken in my ears, so will I do to you. Your carcasses shall fall in this wilderness, and all that were numbered of you, according to your whole number, from 20 years old and upward, which have murmured against me, doubtless ye shall not come into the land, concerning which I swear to make you dwell therein, save Caleb the son of Jephunneh, and Joshua the son of Nun. But your little ones, which ye said should be a prey, them will I bring in, and they shall know the land which ye have despised. But as for you, your carcasses, they shall fall in this wilderness. And your children shall wander in the wilderness, how long? 40 years. And bear your whoredoms until your carcasses be wasted in the wilderness. And the number of the days in which ye search the land, even 40 days, each day for a year, shall ye bear your iniquities, even 40 years, and ye shall know my breach of promise. I, the Lord, have said, I will surely do it unto all this evil generation that are gathered together against me in the wilderness. They shall be consumed, and there they shall die. All right, so it's not too long after fulfilling that first prophetic time schedule. Out there in the wilderness at the border of the land, in response to their unbelief, God's giving them another time schedule. So there's 40 years now out here in the wilderness where they're not going to enter into the land. No matter what they do, God's not going to permit them to enter into that land for 40 years. They're going to be wandering around out there in the wilderness, going nowhere, possessing nothing, until all that generation that was numbered to the war dies off, and their children are going to go and inherit it. So there's a 40-year time segment where Israel knows what they're going to be expecting from the Lord as they're out there in the wilderness. 40 years until they go in to possess it. Okay? Moses attests to that in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is written toward the end of those 40 years. He'll come along and talk about all the things that the Lord had done for them for those 40 years, and how that God had fulfilled that time schedule. Moses was judged by the Lord for smiting the rock when God said to speak to it. And so he was prohibited from entering the land. And he tells them there in Deuteronomy that what's about to take place after these 40 years is that Joshua is going to take over, and Joshua is going to be the one that leads them into the land. Right? So they know what to expect. The next phase of the program is going to be the conquest stage that we've got here after those 40 years are accomplished. And so that takes place, doesn't it? We've looked at Joshua. He leads them in. They begin to go in and to sack the cities of the Canaanites. Jericho being one, Ai another, and they go from city to city and place to place. And the Lord is fighting for them and driving out their enemies before them. And they begin that initial phase of the conquest, initial possession of the land. And after they've got that initial conquest accomplished, Joshua is beginning to divide out the land to the tribes with the understanding that this is going to be progressive as it grows and grows, as they continue to follow the Lord after him. Or at least that's the way it was supposed to be. But if you go over to Joshua 23, we're going to see that Joshua, at the end of his lifetime, after this initial phase of warfare and conquest and possession, that Joshua has been ministering to these people for quite a while now, and he knows what's in their heart. Here in Joshua 24, he will even bring up this issue of their insincerity. this mixture that they have with their devotions to the Lord. And Joshua understands that even though they're supposed to continue to drive out the inhabitants and to not allow them to stand before them and to see the purpose of the Lord advanced, he understands that what's going to happen after his death and that generation is that Israel is going to begin going away from the Lord. And they're not going to be steadfast with their God. And here in Joshua chapter 23, let's pick up in verse 11. Just notice what Joshua's saying here as they've conducted this conquest about really gives us some insight into what's going to be taking place next. Joshua 23 and verse 11. The Bible says, "Take good heed, therefore, unto yourselves that ye love the Lord your God. Else, if ye do in any wise go back and cleave unto the remnant of these nations, even these that remain among you, and shall make marriages with them, and go in unto them, and they to you, know for a certainty that the Lord your God will no more drive out any of these nations from before you. But they shall be snares and traps unto you, and scourges in your sides, and thorns in your eyes." All right, so all this good success that they've had in Joshua's day driving out the enemies, if they don't stay with the Lord, and they don't stay with the law, all that goodness is going to be turned around. And he says that that's going to be the case. They're going to have the thorns in their eyes. Notice this, the word until. There's some chastening that's going to be coming upon you until ye perish from off this good land which the Lord your God hath given you. Verse 14. "And behold, this day I am going the way of all the earth. And ye know that in all your hearts and in all your souls that not one thing hath failed of all the good things which the Lord your God spake concerning you. All are come to pass unto you, and not one thing hath failed thereof. Therefore it shall come to pass that as all good things are come upon you, which the Lord your God promised you, so shall the Lord bring upon you all evil things, until he have destroyed you from off this good land which the Lord your God hath given you. When ye have transgressed the covenant of the Lord your God, which he commanded you, and have gone and served other gods, and bowed yourselves to them, then shall the anger of the Lord be kindled against you, and ye shall perish quickly from off the good land which he hath given unto you." Joshua is addressing the people here on the basis of the law covenant that they're under. You remember back here in the wilderness, early on, they came to Sinai. And they were given the option on how they wanted to be dealt with by the Lord. Did they continue to want Jehovah to deal with them by his name, all that Jehovah means, his grace and his truth, to give them what they've been called unto in the land? Or do they want the performance system? "Be a peculiar treasure unto me, a kingdom of priests and holy nation, if you do all that I command you." And they say, what? We'll do it. All that the Lord has spoken, we will do.
No problem.
Yeah, they contract to merit it and to really demonstrate their own natural spiritual fitness to be utilized in the land according to God's purpose and calling for them. And so they're on a performance system. And Joshua here, as they've come into the land now, under the law, that's the basis upon which they've entered, he's holding them to that covenant. And he's telling them that you've seen all the good things that the Lord's done, right? All this generation, we've been driving out our enemies. None have been able to stand before us while we stay with the Lord. But he says, know that as surely as all the words of God concerning the good things have been true here, if you depart from this law covenant that you're under, what's going to happen to you is that the Lord's going to bring all the evil upon you. And that's the evil that's recorded in the law contract, right? Blessing for obedience, but cursing for disobedience. If you depart, you're going to get all the cursing. And that cursing, right, he says is going to be until you perish from off the land. That's what the law foresaw, right? Leviticus 26. We looked at the courses of punishment. Each one of these, as you go through here, it's all building up and it's mounting until you get over here where they're destroyed from off the land. They're removed, cast outside the land. So he's talking about the terms of the law contract there. And he understands at the end of his life with this insincerity that they've got going on, the lack of steadfastness of their heart to the Lord and to the law, that as this next generation comes on and they go away from the Lord, this evil that he's talking about is what's going to be next for them. Right? The evil of the courses of punishment. And that indeed is what takes place, isn't it? Because after Joshua's generation dies off, there arises a generation which Judges chapter 2 says knew not the Lord. They begin to serve Balaam and Ashtaroth. They don't put out their enemies from before them. They don't teach their children to observe the law. And so in the period of the judges here, the curses, that evil, the first course of punishment starts rolling in. That's the expectation. Now, there's not a definite time schedule associated with that necessarily, but there is time terminology when he's talking about this is going to happen until, right? You're starting to get held accountable to what the law promised, and that is going to continue till you're out of the land. Okay? Now, we've come to the period of the judges. First course of punishment is what we see there in Judges following Joshua. Now, there's actually another way to count time as it relates to this interlude of mercy and blessing. Okay? Now, for this, let's go back to Deuteronomy real quick. Deuteronomy 23. This is a statute of the law here, and a requirement, a prohibition really, that's within the law that we're going to read here that actually has some bearing upon Israel's program historically. It goes back to the days of the patriarchs, even back here as early as Judah. And we'll see that. We've talked about this a little bit, but this is actually the law of the bastard son. And when we talk about, the Bible uses the word bastard here, it's talking about a child of incest. That's what it's talking about. And there's a prohibition concerning this. Verse 2 of Deuteronomy 23, the scripture says, "A bastard shall not enter into the congregation of the Lord, even to his 10th generation shall he not enter into the congregation of the Lord." And we've looked at this in the past. We talked about that terminology of entering into the congregation of the Lord. A few different things that could possibly mean, but the way we talked about it before is that entrance into the congregation there is talking about an issue of holding civil office. Okay, there's a certain requirement for those that are going to hold civil office and enter into the congregation of the Lord to conduct business on behalf of the nation. And the prohibition in the law here is that this child of incest, or this bastard child, is not to do that and not to hold that function until 10 generations have passed. Okay? Now that's significant because of something that we read about earlier on, back in Genesis, I alluded to a minute ago, with Judah. In Genesis 38. If you go back there, I'm just going to show you a few verses with this, but back in the days of the patriarchs, there's a chapter that's inserted here in which we have the way my Bible labels it, it's the shame of Judah. Yeah, he ends up going into what he perceives to be a harlot, and you can read the details of it, but it turns out to be his disguised daughter-in-law. And he goes into her, and she conceives a child by Judah, and that's revealed to him here, the end of chapter 38. Let's pick up in verse 24. Genesis 38:24. It says, "And it came to pass about 3 months after that it was told Judah, saying, Tamar, thy daughter-in-law, hath played the harlot, and also, behold, she is with child by whoredom. And Judah said, Bring her forth, and let her be burnt. When she was brought forth, she sent to her father-in-law, saying, By the man whose these are am I with child. And she said, Discern, I pray thee, whose are these, the signet, and bracelets, and staff? What did he give him for a pledge? Verse 26, And Judah acknowledged them, and said, She hath been more righteous than I, because that I gave her not to Shelah my son. And he knew her again no more. And it came to pass in the time of her travail that, behold, twins were in her womb. And it came to pass when she travailed that one put forth his hand. The midwife took and bound upon his hand a scarlet thread, saying, This came out first. And it came to pass as he drew back his hand, that behold, his brother came out. And she said, How hast thou broken forth? This breach be upon thee. Therefore his name was called Pharez. And afterward came out his brother that had the scarlet thread upon his hand, and his name was called Zara. All right, so you've got this account stuck back here in the midst of the narrative of Genesis concerning Judah. We match that up with Deuteronomy 23, verse 2, understanding that this child of incest, that before there can be one that comes into the congregation of the Lord, 10 generations have to pass from this event. It's significant when you think about the fact that Judah is the son of Israel, who God said that would be the kingly tribe. Right? God's king was to come forth out of Judah. And that was made known back here in Genesis. So you're focused in on the king, the kingly tribe. So what you understand from the law, the requirement for those 10 generations matched up with what happens with Judah here, is that from there forward, 10 generations are going to have to pass before God gives Israel a king there in the land. Now that's their purpose for entering the land, right? To see the kingdom established. Well, if they understand from Joshua that as they depart from the Lord, what's going to be happening is the evil of the law beginning to come in upon them, that first course of punishment in the Judges, and you match that up with this 10-generation law, what you know is that the first course of punishment is going to continue until the point that God's ready to give them a king. 10 generations are going to have to pass. And you can count them from Judah on before they get a king. Now, Ruth chapter 4, see a connection here with this. We've looked at this passage in the past as well. Ruth, of course, time-wise fits into the period of the Judges. And here at the end of the book of Judges, we're given a listing of generations that just so happens to be the line of Judah, starting with Pharez, who is that child of incest from Genesis 38. So Ruth 4:18. Now these are the generations of Pharez. Pharez begat Hezron, and Hezron begat Ram, and Ram begat Amminadab. Amminadab begat Nahshon, and Nahshon begat Salmon. Salmon begat Boaz, and Boaz begat Obed, and Obed begat Jesse, and Jesse begat David. 10 generations. Right? You count the generation from Pharez there. Pharez, Hezron, Ram, Amminadab, Nahshon, Salmon, Boaz, Obed, Jesse, David. 10 generations. And we looked at David, right? That's the king that God said he's after mine own heart. That was God's king. Israel had gotten a generation ahead of that, demanding a king there with Saul, got the wrong one, but God's king and God's purpose all the time was to give them David. And there's a time marker there when you match up those scriptures where you're counting from here all the way through to the time when God's ready to give them a king, which just so happens to correspond to this period that we call the interlude of mercy and blessing. God's blessings in the land under God's king. And it gets underway with the anointing of David there in 1 Samuel chapter 16. Now, go over to 2 Samuel 7. You see how these are linked? Right? There's a linking of time schedules that's building through here. All right, we're through the first course of punishment, anointing of the king there with interlude of mercy. Within that interlude of mercy, 2 Samuel chapter 7, this is the chapter we studied concerning that Davidic covenant. You know that when David is brought to the throne and the tribes of Israel are all unified under his kingdom there, he's got a desire to build the temple. A permanent residence for the God of Israel to come and to dwell in the midst of the land. As a man after God's own heart, he desires God's purpose for the land. And he knows that with Israel, God's purpose that was true back here at the beginning and was vested in Abraham and has been talked about through here is to have God's kingdom established. He wants to have a permanent residence there and build the house of the Lord so he doesn't have to dwell in tents and really get the kingdom started. It's what David's wanting. And the Lord has to tell him that he's not going to allow him to do that. He is going to eventually establish the kingdom, but it's not the right time for that. But in turn, what does the Lord do? He makes a covenant with David in his house. We call it the Davidic covenant, where he covenants for a house, a throne, and a kingdom with David. And Jehovah's going to enflesh himself in David's seed line and ultimately come to sit upon David's throne in the person of the Christ. Well, having denied David the opportunity to build the temple, the house of God, he tells him that he's not going to allow him to do that because he's a man that shed much blood, but what he does say is that he's going to permit his son to do that. And in connection with that, here in 2 Samuel 7, just picking up right in the middle, Back up verse 4. Let's read verse 14 first. He says, "And I will be his father, and he shall be my son. If he commit iniquity, I will chasten him with the rod of men and with the stripes of the children of men." But notice this, verse 15. He says, "But my mercy shall not depart away from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I put away before thee." So within this Davidic covenant, God tells him that he's going to allow his son to build the house. And this mercy that Jehovah has begun to show to his people here, starting with David, he promises David there in the Davidic covenant that when his son comes along, that even if he does wickedness and departs from the Lord, there may be chastening that the Lord brings upon him, but he's not going to take away his mercy from him. Which tells you that as long as David's son is still on the throne, the mercy is going to continue. God's not going to resume the course of punishment while David's son is on the throne, for David's sake. We can see that playing out too. 1 Kings chapter 11. Once Solomon does come to the throne, we know the story of Solomon, how he does well early on, but then he departs from the Lord, and he begins to set up those high places there before the temple, after he's built it, and he's gone after these strange wives and strange gods, and the Lord's angry with Solomon as a result of that. But even so with Solomon, the nation has become worthy of having the resumption of the evil of the law and having this second course of punishment brought upon them in the days of Solomon. God announces the fact that they're worthy of that, but he's not going to bring it until a certain time. 1 Kings 11, verse 11. It says, "Wherefore the Lord said unto Solomon, Forasmuch as this is done of thee, and thou hast not kept my covenant and my statutes which I have commanded thee, I will surely rend the kingdom from thee, and will give it to thy servant. Notwithstanding, in thy days I will not do it for David thy father's sake, but I will rend it out of the hand of thy son. Howbeit, I will not rend away all the kingdom, but will give one tribe to thy son for David my servant's sake, and for Jerusalem's sake, which I have chosen." Skip down to verse 35. He says, "But I will take the kingdom out of his son's hand, and will give it to thee, even 10 tribes. And unto his son will I give one tribe, that David my servant may have a light always before me in Jerusalem, in the city which I have chosen me to put my name there." Let's see here. He says in verse 37, "And I will take thee, and thou shalt reign according to all that thy soul desireth, and thou shalt be king over Israel. And it shall be, if thou wilt hearken unto all that I command thee, that I will walk in my ways, and do that which is right in my sight, to keep my statutes and my commandments, as David my servant did, that I will surely be with thee, and build thee a sure house, as I built for David, and will give Israel unto thee. And I will for this afflict the seed of David, but not forever." And he's talking to Jeroboam there. And I think I skipped my verse that I actually wanted to read here. Sorry about that. But he gives the time there. I think the point was that I made in the earlier verse was the fact that he says that he's not going to do it in his son's days, is the basic point that I'm after. When you've got a starting point with those 10 generations with God's king and the mercy, he tells them in the Davidic covenant that he's not going to take away the mercy from his son. And yet when Solomon transgresses and they become worthy of the resumption of the courses of punishment, he says he's not going to do it in his days, but he'll do it in his son's days. Right? And we know that the rending of the kingdom feature of the second course of punishment follows Solomon's death, which is what the next chapter relates. Amen. Amen. So, a link that you can see in this period of mercy ending and the announcement of the second course of punishment and these things of the curses are going to come back after Solomon's death. So there's a time period. As long as Solomon's alive, you know the mercy is going to continue and those courses of punishment are not going to resume. Okay, but when Solomon dies, that's a time marker. We know what's coming next. The division of the kingdom, starting that second course of punishment and moving on with the program. Okay? Now, for the rest of this program, if you come back to Deuteronomy 28, please. Deuteronomy chapter 28. Now, Deuteronomy 28, again, is part of the law. This is a chapter that corresponds closely to our 5 courses of punishment theme chapter, Leviticus 26. if you parallel the two, you're going to see a lot of the same curses talked about. And it's really talking about the same things. It's talking about these courses of punishment that are part of the law. The difference is in the way that it's described. Leviticus is very systematic about, going through course 1, 2, 3, and having that 7 times more terminology, breaking it out in that subsequent fashion that way. Deuteronomy 28 is still talking about those same things, but what you're going to see is that as it's talking about each one of these courses of punishment through here, it's going to talk about each one of these and the curses that make them up in view of the fact that it's ultimately going to lead to this one, where they're carried out from the land. So all the courses of punishment leading to the 5th. And so all the curses that are described about each one of these things are talked about continuing until they're destroyed from off the land. Okay?
He's talking to a different audience than you, right?
Different generation, yeah. After the wilderness 40 years there, right? So yeah, recounting or rehearsal of those same types of issues of the law that the earlier generation had received. But again, you see the term until coming up again, which is the time marker. This is going to happen until something is accomplished. Okay, so it can continue to happen until it is accomplished. And just to give you a sampling of that, let's look here at Deuteronomy 28, verse 21. He said, "The Lord shall make the pestilence cleave unto thee until he have consumed thee from off the land whither thou goest to possess it." Right, these are the first course of punishment curses, continuing until a certain time out here. Verse 22, "The Lord shall smite thee with consumption and with fever, with an inflammation and with an extreme burning, and with the sword and with blasting and with mildew, and they shall pursue thee," here it is again, "until thou perish." You're the 5th. Look at verse 24. "The Lord shall make the rain of thy land powder and dust. From heaven shall it come down upon thee until thou be destroyed. The Lord shall cause thee to be smitten before thine enemies. Thou shalt go out one way against them and flee 7 ways before them, and shalt be removed into all the kingdoms of the earth." So he's talking about second course of punishment, cursing there, but it's until they're removed in the 5th. Skip on over to verse 45. "Moreover, all these curses shall come upon thee, and shall pursue thee, and overtake thee, till thou be destroyed. Because thou hearkenest not unto the voice of the Lord thy God, to keep his commandments and his statutes, which he commanded thee." Verse 48. "Therefore shalt thou serve thine enemies, which the Lord shall send against thee in hunger and in thirst and in nakedness and in want of all things. And he shall put a yoke of iron upon thy neck until he have destroyed thee." Verse 51. "And he shall eat the fruit of thy cattle and the fruit of thy land until thou be destroyed, which also shall not leave thee either corn, wine, or oil, or the increase of thy kine or flocks of thy sheep, until he have destroyed thee." Verse 52. "And he shall besiege thee in all thy gates, until thy high and fenced walls come down, wherein thou trustest throughout all thy land. And he shall besiege thee in all thy gates throughout all thy land, which the Lord thy God hath given thee." And then verse 61. "Also every sickness and every plague which is not written in the book of this law, them will the Lord bring upon thee until thou be destroyed." So the point here is that in these courses of punishment, God talks about those things running a particular course. These things are going to be coming upon thee until it ultimately results in you being carried off the land. So what you know then is that once this mercy's over and the courses of punishment resume, that's the name of the game that's going to continue rolling until the captivity's arrived at. There's a time frame, right? There may be not a specific number of years that are associated with that, but there's this general outline, if you will, of how their history is going to go until a certain thing takes place. Cursing upon cursing upon cursing for their disobedience until they're removed from off the land. That's the law foresaw and talked about. And you can see that. So the course of punishment leading to the captivity. And there's various other smaller time segments that you can map out as you're working your way through here, where God will talk about certain things where you can kind of break out the curses, just as an example. When you get to the third course of punishment, in Ahab's reign. Of course, he lived in the second, but he becomes worthy of the third course of punishment. But he humbles himself before the Lord, and he says he's not going to bring the evil in his days. So you know, as long as Ahab's alive, the third course of punishment is not coming. It's coming in his son's days. Ahab dies, his son comes on the scene, third course of punishment starts. In the third course of punishment, Elisha will come along and he'll predict that the fourth course is coming during the reign of Hazael, king of Syria. In that fourth course, Jehu's promised 4 generations to sit upon the throne. So you know that the fifth course of punishment cannot come until the generational time frame has passed. Hezekiah is given an extension of 15 years in Judah, so that you know that the fifth course of punishment can't come in that amount of time. There's a prophecy sitting back in 1 Kings 13 about one Josiah who would come and execute judgment upon the altars of Bethel. And so until there's been a king in Judah, by Josiah by name, that has fulfilled those prophecies, you know that Judah is not going to be carried away captive. Little time markers that you can see really all through here where God's giving them prophecies and blocks of times and measuring marks for when they can expect certain things to happen, all the way up until they're removed from the land of the captivity. Then you, of course, get into this captivity where Jeremiah is used of the Lord to prophesy and to give Israel yet another time demarcation of 70 years for what they can expect in the next segment of the program. So all that to say that God in prophecy deals with Israel according to timetables, time markers. And it's been the case from Abraham all the way through here, where God is giving them a revelation of a certain segment of time where they can expect and look for certain things to be taking place in Israel. And here this prophecy of 70 years is no different than that. It fits into a thread of timetables that God's been mapping out all the way through. Again, a prophecy program. Now, we're at time. I do want to just go to 2 other passages to close this out. I'll just tell you that Acts 7 is also a good passage to study in connection with this. These time markers that I've given you, you can identify most all of those in Acts 7 when Stephen's recounting their history to the rulers of Israel there in Acts 7. And he'll mention almost all those points that I've talked about as we track the time through there. And so you can go home and study that on your own and look for those time markers there in Acts 7. But all that to show the linkage back to where we were in 2 Chronicles 36. And again, that verse 21 to close out the book there said that their captivity, Jerusalem there in particular, was to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah until the land enjoyed her Sabbaths. For as long as she lay desolate, she kept Sabbath to fulfill 70 years. Now, since I mentioned Jeremiah, let me just take you to those passages and we'll close with this. Okay? Jeremiah 25 and Jeremiah 29. Just want to show you that Jeremiah did prophesy what the history says there. And we'll probably come back and pick this up here next time. But let's look at verse 10. Jeremiah 25 and verse 10. Verse 11, rather. He says, "And this whole land shall be a desolation and an astonishment, and these nations shall serve the king of Babylon." How long? 70 years. "And it shall come to pass, when 70 years are accomplished, that I will punish the king of Babylon and that nation, saith the Lord, for their iniquity, and the land of the Chaldeans, and will make it perpetual desolations." So 70 years are going to be accomplished in Babylon before the Lord judges it. And then chapter 29. Verse 10. He says, "For thus saith the Lord, that after 70 years be accomplished at Babylon, I will visit you and perform my good word towards you in causing you to return to this place. For I know the thoughts that I think towards you, saith the Lord, thoughts of peace and not of evil, to give you an expected end." You've got the presence of the prophecy of 70 years once again, but now you've got the added detail that after those 70 years, God is going to permit them to return, right? A remnant's going to return. Now, while the 70 years are ongoing, they're completely removed from the land, off the land. The land's enjoying their Sabbath. It's desolate, having its rest. But once those land years have been fulfilled, he said he's going to punish the king of Babylon, and he's going to permit them to return, a remnant to return back to that good land, because he says there, I know the thoughts that I think towards you, saith the Lord, thoughts of peace and not of evil, to give you an expected end. Even though Israel has totally messed it up under the law, right? Totally messed it up under the law. When they're getting carried out of the land, that's not God saying he's all done with them. There's an expected end that God says he's going to give this people. And this is not going to stand in the way of that. He's going to bring them back, and he's still going to fulfill his purpose with them after that time. And so obviously that's going to have a profound impact upon things that take place from this point forward and what God's going to be doing with them. And that's just some insight into what's coming next on the timeline. And so we'll pick it up there next time. Amen.
Daniel's going to read one of them, read about Jeremiah. He's going to read about it. He's going to start putting it together.
Absolutely. Amen. Exciting studies upcoming in the next few weeks. Amen. Amen. Our God and Father, we're thankful for the time tonight. We pray that you would take these scriptures and these things that we've tried to use to demonstrate your timetables and your prophecy program with the nation of Israel, and use them for the edification of the saints, I pray, and the furtherance of our knowledge of you and your word. We give you the thanks and the praise. In Christ's name.